All right, hey class. So this week we're going to start things off with Spanish conquest of the Americas. And what I'd like to do in this lecture before I get into the content is to give you a conceptual framework within which to think about this era of history. Now, as I mentioned in the orientation video, we focus on the critical thinking approach, why this particular history is significant. So we're going to look at what happened during conquest, and we're going to think critically about how we remember it today. I want you to approach this topic through the lens of popular memory and think about what the implications and social consequences are for how we discuss conquest in our public spaces, in our schools, and even in society, basically how we think about it in our national memory. Now, one thing that I want you to understand as we begin this critical thinking approach is that history is interpretive, okay? What we know to be true about our history is really what experts have written. It's interpreted by very human historians who are looking at what happened in the past through their own cultural lens. Now, what this means is that they view the events of the past through their own contemporary bias, their own set of values and assumptions based on their own culture and society. Now, what actually happened in the past happened, but how that history is interpreted and portrayed tells us a lot about the values of the historian, or it tells us about the values of the society that historian is part of. Now, the story of conquest is not unlike any other era in history in this way. What happened during conquest happened, but how we remember it, right, or how it's portrayed, who is included in the story, whose perspective is privileged and whose perspective is ignored, etc. So how it's portrayed in our textbooks, in our public spaces, and in our institutions, it really tells us something about our own values. Okay, so what we think we know about conquest is really based on myth and bias. All right, so first I want to talk about some historical myths about conquest that have worked their way into our historical narrative. Because you can't really understand the significance of conquest without understanding that much of what you know about it has been constructed in a way to create a shared history and to justify the exploitation and destruction of native cultures. Okay, so I'll do that, and then I'll get into what happened during conquest. I'll talk about the people who lived in the Americas before 1492 when Columbus arrived, and then I'm going to discuss the European perspective a little bit, talk about Columbus, talk about Spain, and why they decided to sail west. And this decision really had profound consequences as it reshaped the entire perspective and makeup of the world. It gave rise to capitalism and empire. So there's a lot to talk about here. So let's get started, okay? All right, so I just mentioned historical myths, and you may be wondering, what are some popular myths about European conquest? Well, one of the most common is that Columbus discovered America, okay? We have a whole national holiday that commemorates his discovery of America. But can you really be credited for discovering something that has already been in use by others for thousands of years? So this is kind of problematic, okay? Another is the vast and virgin continent myth, okay? The Europeans came over, and as quoted by one historian from the 1960s, they came over to colonize a vast and virgin continent sparsely peopled by Indians. So the problem here is that this suggests that there was basically no one here when the Europeans arrived, that this land was basically theirs for the taking. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that there were actually hundreds of millions of native people living in the Americas at the time of Columbus's first voyage. And what ultimately made the land so sparse was that approximately 90% of the native population was decimated by disease, by murder, and by harsh working conditions within a system of forced labor, okay? So another myth is that native people were savage and barbaric, and that Europeans brought civilization to the Western Hemisphere. Now, terms like savage and barbaric and civilization, those are subjective. What this really reveals is a pro-European cultural bias, okay? Now, the significant thing about these myths is that they have historically justified European conquest, and in doing so, they've ignored the painful violence experienced by Native people at the hands of the Europeans. And these myths have somehow worked their way into our historical narrative. Um, when I was a kid growing up in the 1980s, we had like a whole pageant to celebrate Columbus's discovery of America, right? So this is in our schools. These myths have permeated into our schools. So anyway, they've worked their way into our historical narrative. And as historians, we want to look at the primary sources, okay, those firsthand accounts of what actually happened, examine some of these myths, and determine for ourselves what the legacy of conquest should be, how we, as collective members of this American community, memorialize conquest, particularly men like Columbus, okay? So that's the framework. Now I want to give you some background information, okay? What happened when Columbus entered the Americas? Now, I know I mentioned that we focus on the whys of history, not the whats, but in order to think critically about why this history is significant, first we have to know what happened. Okay, now keep in mind the myths that I just mentioned, and ask yourself, did Columbus really discover America? Was the land empty when Europeans arrived? Who were the savage barbarians, and what defines a civilization? Okay, so just keep those questions in mind as we work through the what happened of conquest here. Okay, so Spanish conquest of the Americas. Okay, the first people. All right, the first people to encounter Columbus in 1492 were the Taínos. Now, sometimes these people are referred to as the Arawaks. The Arawak is a name given to describe like a larger group of natives in which the Taíno are a part of, right? So since we're talking specifically about this group, I'm going to use the Taíno name, okay? The Taínos inhabited the Caribbean islands that we now know as like Bahamas, Haiti, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and a few other surrounding islands nearby. And, one thing I want to mention too is that we know what we know about the Taínos because the Spanish described them in really great detail in their journals. So most of what I'm telling you today about the Taínos is actually from Columbus himself. And a lot of what we know comes from another guy named Bartolome de las Casas, who was a priest, a Spanish priest. And I'm going to spend a little time later talking about de las Casas and his significance. But I want to start with the Taínos, and I want to explain who they were, and I want to talk about, what happened when Columbus invaded their lands. Okay. Now, the Taínos were peaceful people. They were well known for their hospitality and generosity. They were not complete pacifists. They did go to war with other groups, but it was not usually for political or geographical reasons. It was usually based on some kind of personal offense or moral reason. They had no iron. Their weapons and their spears were made out of cane and wood. In fact, when they encountered the metal swords of the Spanish noted that they cut themselves out of ignorance because they'd never seen any kind of sharp metal before. They lived communally. They lived in these large bell-shaped dwellings that held up to 600 people. They were spinners and weavers. They had agriculture, but they didn't have any work animals or horses. Horses were actually brought over by the Spanish. They had no commerce. Everything they had, they got from nature, and they didn't really value possessions the way that Europeans did. They didn't really feel entitled to personal property. Everything was shared openly and given freely. Now, as I mentioned before, they were incredibly generous and hospitable, and they would share or offer anything they had as gifts if they knew it was something you wanted. And as far as their looks, according to Columbus, they were well built with good bodies and handsome features. That was a quote he wrote in his journal. And then de las Casas describes them as very agile. He says they could swim long distances. So kind of the perception here is that they were maybe athletic and strong, right? They didn't wear clothing. They wore feathers and beads made out of fishbone and these green and white stones in their ears and their lips. And they also wore gold ornaments in their ears, okay, which of course catches Columbus's attention, and things spiral downhill from there. But I'll talk about that shortly. So no clothes, just jewelry. The Taínos were what we would call today is egalitarian. Okay, women had a tremendous amount of power and agency. De las Casas notes that the Spanish were so unaccustomed to how well the Taino women were treated, they didn't really know what to do. I guess for them, encountering a society where women are treated as equal to men must have been shocking, coming from a culture so deeply entrenched in patriarchy and male entitlement. So women were treated very well. There were no marriage laws. Men and women were free to enter relationships, choose their mates. They could enter relationships as they liked, and they could leave relationships without any jealousy or anger. They were just very open and understanding in terms of relationships. Okay, so overall, the Tainos were kind, peaceful, hospitable people who were eager to make friends with Columbus and his men. All right. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about every indigenous group in the Americas. I'm just really focusing on the Tainos for a couple of reasons. All right. So you get a clear understanding of who Columbus encountered when he arrived, and then because they are actually not unlike most other groups in North America. Now, I don't want to group them all into one generalized kind of idea of Native Americans. There were thousands of different, the cultures and languages and practices were incredibly diverse. But one thing that is similar is that the temperament, the values, and also the initial interactions with the Europeans were very similar. Oops, too far. Okay. So the Tainos' experience and their attitude toward the Spanish was not unlike others who the Spanish encountered. Okay, now I want to give a little background on Columbus himself. Okay, he was actually not Spanish. Okay, so he was Italian. He was a merchant's clerk and part-time weaver from Genoa, but he was also a brilliant sailor, and he had much bigger aspirations. Okay, he didn't want to stay a merchant's clerk and part-time weaver for his whole life. All right, and now in Spain, by the 1490s, Spain had finished an 800-year war against the Moors, and they had expelled all the Jews from the country. Okay, so they're sort of entering this new era, and they were in a political and financial place to start investing in an overseas market, right? And they had a little competition. Okay, Portugal had funded explorations to find shorter routes to Asia, and Spain was feeling a little pressure, like, hey, maybe we need to get in on that action, right? So they decide to fund a small expedition and of three ships and 39 crew members. And so Columbus, who has these aspirations, he's the one who actually approached them with his idea. They decide to fund it, 3 ships, 39 crew members, and they offer Columbus a pretty sweet deal. All right, he gets 10% of profit of anything he finds. He gets governorship of any and all lands he claims for Spain. And he gets this really cool new title, the Admiral of the Sea. Okay, so they agreed to fund his expedition, and he ends up leaving out of the Canary Islands and sets sail for what he thinks is going to be Asia. Okay, so when he arrived in what is now the Bahamas, he encounters the friendly Taínos. All right, they actually, they were really eager to meet him. Okay, so they see him out there, and they actually swim out to greet them with gifts. They offer to trade anything that the Spanish wanted. They were very hospitable and very generous. And when they meet, what happens is Columbus notices the gold ornaments that they wore in their ears, and he starts to think, hey, there must be gold fields on this island, okay, which he can of course exploit and become super rich. So what happens is pretty quickly, against their will, Columbus forces some of the Taínos on board his ship, and he makes them tell him where he can find gold. Okay, so forces them on a ship. They start talking. Oh, there's gold in this other place, right? So they sail to Cuba, and then to Hispaniola, which is today, Hispaniola is what today would be Haiti and the Dominican Republic. All right, so they get there and they sort of happen to find some gold in a river, which encouraged Columbus, right? He's like, oh, this is a good thing. And then what happens is this local chief gives him a gold mask as a gift. Okay, and it's after this gift that he becomes completely convinced that it was this place where he would get rich. All right, so he starts to think big picture. So what he does is he orders his men to build a military fort out of the timbers of the Santa Maria, okay, which had run aground. He names the fort Navidad, which means Christmas, and he leaves 39 crew members there with instructions to find and store gold. Okay, so he takes more Tainos captive, forces them on board his ship, and he sets sail back to Spain. Now, when Columbus sets sail back to Spain, his whole purpose is to get the king and queen to fund a much larger expedition because he really wants to get back there, back to Hispaniola, where with more resources so that he can extract as much gold as he possibly can. All right. So what he does is when he meets with the king and queen, he exaggerates his findings. Okay, so he really embellishes what he finds. He tells them about all of this gold and all of these spices, and he talks about these naive Indians who could be easily dominated and ruled, right? So he really sells it like, hey, this could get us rich, and you could have all this wealth, and you could have all this land, and these people will be loyal to you. And he's basically saying, fund me and I'll bring back as much gold as you need and as many slaves as you want. Okay. And so that's exactly what they do. They're sold. And so what they do is they approve a second expedition. All right. So Columbus's second expedition gets 17 ships and about 1,200 men. And, one important point I want to make here is that the bigger the expedition, the larger the investment, okay? And then the more profit that you have to produce to pay back the people who funded that expedition, right? So this is very significant. As Columbus falls short on the gold promises, he has to resort to more and more slave raids to pay back the dividends to the investors, okay? So now, another thing I want to point out too is it's in his second expedition that we can clearly see his exploitative intentions. Okay, he is focused solely on getting gold, no matter the cost of human life. Okay, now when he gets back to the Americas, he goes island to island taking captives, and word spreads among the natives about what's going on. And so as he's going island to island to try to get more people, he's finding more and more villages turning up empty because they caught wind of what he was doing. In fact, in Haiti, he found in one place that the European men that had been left behind before he left, they had been killed by the natives after roaming the island, raping the women and children. Okay, so natives were talking to each other. The different communities within these islands were communicating with each other about the awful things that were happening by the hand of the Spanish. Okay. Now, if you recall, also Haiti is where the military base is, Navidad. Okay, so it's located there. So Columbus decides to make this his headquarters, and what he does is he starts rounding up Tainos and he forces them to mine for gold. He sends expedition after expedition into the interior of the island to look for gold fields. Now, remember too, he has to find something of value to fill up the ships to send back to Spain. Okay, so he's got to pay back those investors who funded this expedition. Now, when the gold falls short, he decides to send back more slaves. So in 1495, there's this great slave raid. He orders his men to capture 1,500 men, women, and children, to put them in pens, and then the best 500 specimens were chosen and loaded aboard the ship headed back to Spain. Okay, so on the way, 200 of them died. Okay, so they didn't, almost half didn't make the voyage. Okay, so when they get to Spain, the 300 who did survive were put up for sale by the archdeacon of the town. All right, so thus begins the great slave trade of Native Americans in Spain. All right, now the problem for Columbus was that the slave plan wasn't working out. Too many of the Tainos were dying in captivity, and so he becomes even more determined at this point to find a way to get more gold, okay? And this really proves disastrous for the Tainos. It was just an impossible task. There just wasn't the gold that Columbus wanted, all right? So in the province of Chicao on Haiti, Columbus mandated that all persons age 14 and up had to collect a certain amount of gold every 3 months, okay? And if they did collect their quota, if they did meet their quota, they would get these copper coins. And if they were caught without their copper coin, meaning either they didn't meet their quota or they just like lost their copper coin or something, they would have their hands cut off and they would just be left to bleed out and die, okay? Very few people met these quotas because it was really just impossible. There just wasn't enough gold in Haiti to satisfy Columbus's greed. And the Tainos were in a very terrible position. And, you know, they had very limited options in terms of resistance. You know, what are they going to do against the Spanish steel, right? They just couldn't fight them. So, you know, some people tried to flee, but when they attempted to flee, they'd be hunted down by dogs and killed. And you know, what happens is many people opt for suicide to escape the violence and cruelty. So there are these mass suicides. People were killing their infants to save them from the Spanish. And so, you know, all of this death was happening. And after 2 years, half of the 250,000 population people, the Taino people, were dead of murder, mutilation, or suicide. Okay, so 250,000 in 2 years, half of them were dead. Okay. So eventually it becomes clear that there's no gold, right? The Tainos were then taken and forced to work as slave labor on these large estates that would later be called encomiendas, but not at this point, okay? So they were enslaved to work on these large estates, and you know what happened there is the working conditions were so harsh that they died by the thousands, okay? They just couldn't meet the demands of the Spanish, okay? So by 1515, there were only 50,000 Tainos left. And by 1550, there were only 500, okay? So the numbers, the population of the natives during these years that Spain had come over and taken over their land, their population was decimated, okay? Just completely decimated. And, you know, a lot of what we know about the treatment of natives comes from a guy named Bartolome de las Casas, okay? So I mentioned him earlier. He was a young priest who came to the Americas as part of the religious conquest. You know, that was actually part of the deal for Spain too. It was a conquest of people and land and resources, but it was also, let's spread Christianity into the Americas as well. So he's this priest. He comes over as part of, you know, to convert the natives. And what happens is he gets there and he witnesses these horrible atrocities being committed against the Tainos. He ends up spending pretty much his whole life writing about what he saw and advocating for the natives to the government in Spain to try to get them to change policies, to try to get laws in place to protect them from the cruelty of the Spanish men. And so, you know, he wrote several books, and in these books he talks about how the Spanish were mistreating the natives. And so he writes that he witnessed the killing of infants and children just for fun. You know, he described a time where these two Spanish men encountered two young Taino boys with parrots on a path, and so they took the parrots and for fun they cut off the boys' heads. Okay, he witnessed babies being taken from their mothers and thrown into like a raging river. He saw men test the sharpness of their blades by slicing off pieces of flesh from the natives, and they would make bets to see, who could cut off a man's head with one swipe of the sword, that kind of stuff. Just this complete disregard for pain, suffering, and human life. And one of the most appalling things I remember when I was in college, and I read De Las Casas's book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. He talks about these things, and one of the most horrible things that I remember reading was that he described how the Spanish would burn the Taínos alive, 13 at a time, in honor of the Savior and the Savior and the 12 apostles. Okay, so this really just disgusted De Las Casas. He was totally appalled by what he saw in Hispaniola. And, he really, his point of view was that this is so unchristian, right? So he's a priest. He's centered in this. He's got a much more humane, or his view is rooted in his humanity, right? And so he sees the Taínos as humans, as brothers, as sisters, and he's just horrified by what he sees. He even writes in one of his accounts that he trembles as he writes what he's witnessed, because it was so awful for him to go through. But aside from the physical violence, he talks too. De Las Casas mentions that the Spanish degraded them and humiliated them in other ways. They would force the Taínos to walk around with these large leaves to shield them from the sun or to fan them from the heat. And one of the things that really, all of it really bothers me, but one of the things that stood out to me was that De Las Casas said that the Spanish men stopped, they didn't want to walk anywhere anymore. So instead of walking from one place to another, they would force a Taíno to carry them on their back. And so, just the inhumanity, the degradation, just the way that the Spanish men treated them physically and emotionally and psychologically, De Las Casas really had a hard time with. And so he worked his whole life to try to get policies to change and to try to defend the native people. He also gives us a lot of accounts in terms of forced labor in the mines. He talked about in his account how, men were actually forced to work 6 to 8 month shifts in the gold mines. So that means they were gone for 6 to 8 months at a time. And in this process, a third of them died. Women were forced to stay back and work the soil. And, so this means that the men are gone for 6 to 8 months. Women are back working the soil. And, a couple of things here, right? They're left without male protection, which didn't really matter anyway, because the Spanish could kind of do anything they wanted. But also they only saw they didn't really have husbands, they didn't have marriage, but they didn't see their partners for 6 to 8 months. They only saw them maybe once a year. And so, what this did was, it really led to a drastic decrease in the population. Okay. They were so exhausted when they did come together that they just didn't procreate. And so these low reproduction rates combined with high rates of death, it really just resulted in an entire population being decimated. Okay, so that's a real quick kind of summary of what happened in those first several years in the Americas by Columbus and his men. And I want to go back to the myths I mentioned earlier. Okay, so thinking about those myths, there were millions of people thriving and living in the Americas before Columbus discovered it. All right, this was not an empty continent. And if we look at what happened, who were the savages? Who acted in cruel barbarism? Right, these myths that I talked about before, they do something very subtle, but they have profound consequences that are damaging. They presume in a very subtle way that European culture is superior to native cultures, right? They ignore the perspectives of people like the Taínos, all right? By claiming that Columbus discovered America, it erases thousands of years of cultural history, and it assumes ownership over a land that was not theirs to begin with, right? It's like someone coming into your house, looking right at you and saying, hey, I just discovered this great place, and then asking you, where's the beer, right? Like it implies that there's no regard for the human life or culture that resides there. And, it really suggests that they are inferior, that they don't matter, okay? So when we think about conquest, how should we regard it in our institutions, right? In our history classrooms, our textbooks, and how should we regard it in our public memory, right? In our statues and public monuments, our national holidays, right? Also, how does it fit into our own personal narrative as being part of the beginning of our nation? And also, what does it say about our own cultural values that we know about the violence and exploitation, yet we still celebrate Columbus Day, right? So these are some questions that I hope you'll ponder on your own. And as you read through the primary accounts from this period, I hope you'll think about, how those events are treated in the way that we remember Columbus today. One thing I want to mention too is history and memory are not the same thing, right? History is what happened in the past. We can kind of categorize history as the what actually happened, even though I talked about it being interpretive, right? But the past is the past. It is what happened. Memory is how we conceptualize that past to evoke an emotion, okay? So think about these things, and that's all I have for this lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.